Tariff announcements last April have significantly disrupted freight and shipping from China to the US. After a drop in April and May, volumes of imports to the US have risen back to where they usually are at this time of year, but the origins of these imports have changed. Container volumes from China to the US range between 2.1 and 2.4 million 20-foot equivalent units per month. Total volumes depend on whether Chinese products are pricing into the US and how much the consumer wants. But in general, we have a seasonal low in February due to the Chinese Lunar New Year. And otherwise, we see an increase in volumes through the summer as the importers in the US stock up prior to the holidays. China is the largest exporter of finished products into the USA, with about 16.5% of the total goods imported overall. On dry bulk trades, volumes tend to come from the USA to China. So, for example, grain and agricultural commodities and coal goes to China. China is the largest consumer of coal worldwide, with consuming over 4 billion tons of coal per year. So there was a time where China imports of grain were about 60% of total US exports. And on the liquid trades, China does import US crude oil. It likes the light and sweet varieties of US crude, and has been increasing that over the last few years. It's been a regular trade, and a new export capacity in the US has been built in order to make sure that the largest can deliver that crude to China. And in gas, in LNG and LPG, again, with the increase in US production of natural gas, the Chinese importers have signed significant capacity deals with US producers and represented about 5% of total US exports. And we're expected to expand those imports into China of US natural gas over the next few years. In general, tariffs and trade wars change trade flows. And I think we need to look at the current administration goals here, bringing production of finished and semi-finished products back to the US and to somewhat isolate China. And so far, we're seeing on that not necessarily success. So containers-wise, total US imports of containers are actually up 5.3% compared to the same period in 2024. And this may have been front-loaded because of expected increases in tariffs. China's share of USA imports fell to about 29.3% on containers, and it's the lowest level in 2 years. But in conjunction with that, US importers are really trying to find additional suppliers of those finished products, which is mainly benefiting Southeast Asia regions. So if no deal with China is reached over the next few weeks, what you could see is container volumes from China fall considerably unless importers in the US can pass on those additional costs, either to the Chinese sellers of the products or the American consumer. Well, on dry bulk, volumes of trade between the US and China have changed dramatically over the last few years. Firstly, China has really started sourcing its grain from Brazil as much as possible. When I talk about grain, I mean soybeans also. And from a coal perspective, as we discussed earlier, China was importing more US coal. They're now starting to expand their coal imports from Australia rather than relying on US commodities. I think it's fair to say that as the trade war discussions kicked off, China made a very specific effort on dry bulk to go and source products from elsewhere. China still comes to the US to buy agricultural products like soybeans and corn. But what they'll do first is max out their imports from other regions. So typically China will come to the US in the fourth quarter during the US harvest season and export from the US ports. So it's been able to import sufficient quantities from other countries. So the US share of Chinese imports has actually fallen quite considerably. And China has been very active in securing those alternative sources. So, for example, Brazil now exports 80% of their soybean exports to China. And in previous years, the US used to export about 60% of their soybeans to China, but that's come down now to below 50%. Since the start of the tariff and trade war with China, China has actually stopped importing US crude. And so in June of 2024, Chinese imports of US crude were valued probably near to around $800 million. By June 2025, no shipments have arrived of US crude in Chinese ports. So who's benefited from that? Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Malaysia are the main exporters of crude oil to China. And then if you look at the natural gas trades, since the start of the tariffs and trade wars, no US natural gas imports have reached China, as imports cannot live with the 125% tariffs that the Chinese authorities have put on US gas imports. Thank you for having me today, and like and subscribe.